But for the sake of time, I just wanted to maybe launch into some questions that we have, rather than go into. We're going to grill you, but I think some people are looking a bit bleary-eyed and bushed. So let me start off with a question. I hope everybody's listening. This is the first question that we had, and you should have got a copy of this, Mark. How do you explain the light from distant stars reaching Earth in only 6,000 years with the time it takes light to travel? So this is a familiar question that one gets, so fire away.
It is. Thank you, Carl, and thanks to whomever put that question. It's one of those, I guess, perennials, because there is no simple answer. People look for a simple answer, but unfortunately there isn't. And it turns out that the way in which space, time and matter interact is not intuitive. In fact, in our everyday experience, we actually see no connection between space, time and matter. We see them as independent things, but indeed they are not. But I guess if I could just set a couple of parameters for framing our understanding. Firstly, we need to remember that the creation week was a week of miracles. God was speaking into existence things which did not previously exist. Mm-hmm. So when and it was a one-off event which we didn't observe. So we're not dealing with something which is within the scope of the scientific method. Yeah. So on the one hand, we could say that whatever happened in the creation week was miraculous, and there is no way we're going to understand it, including how God created the universe so large and it is so young. However, there is a perspective which does invite some effort at discovery, and that is that God's method of doing things always seems to be line upon line, precept upon precept. You see, he starts laying foundations and then builds upon those foundations. For instance, he didn't create Adam and Eve in suspension and then create the rest of the universe and the earth around them and finally finish it all at the end of day 6. They came when everything was ready and set for them to be created in the Garden of Eden. Yes. So given that the laws of physics would have been essentially established in the first day or 2, especially when God said, "Let there be light" on day 1, physicists who are Bible believers have ventured to come up with some ideas about what might have happened on day 4 as God spoke the sun, moon and stars into existence. And there have been several attempts to look at how we might explain the distant starlight problem. And people would probably be familiar with those. In fact, John Hartnett, who lives in Perth, many of you would know him personally, did a great deal of work developing a time dilation-based model. And essentially what that is about is the Bible speaks of God stretching out the heavens. And if you do that and distort space, if that's what that means, and it seems to, then you would actually distort time. So you could have considerable amounts of elapsed time at the outer reaches of the universe, all within one Earth day. Yep. Dr. Russell Humphreys in the US has developed a time dilation model also, but not based on cosmological dilation, which Hartnett did, but more on gravitational. And he's developed a couple of different models. Now, the time dilation models show a lot of promise. They do give us I guess, a framework to hang our thinking on, but they don't address everything. There have been other attempts. One very famous one goes back several decades now from Barry Setterfield, was to assume that the speed of light has actually been decreasing to its present value. That now is not generally supported in the creationist community because there are so many other flow-on effects which you would see, but which we don't, if that in fact had happened. Another one is that God just created the light beams in transit. The problem with that is that we would see events like supernova explosions and what have you, with all the associated physics embedded in those that electromagnetic spectrum arriving on Earth, which didn't actually occur, which would imply a sort of sense of deception on God's behalf. So we tend not to go down that path. There's a very interesting model that's currently doing the rounds and being examined in much detail. It's more a philosophical approach. It turns out that when we measure the speed of light, we only ever measure the two-way speed of light. that is from the observer to a source and then back again, you can't actually measure the one-way speed of light. Now, you'd think you could devise an experiment to do that, but the moment you try and synchronize a remote clock, you actually introduce a two-way measurement. Mm-hmm. And it's been convention, in fact, it's called the Einsteinian Synchrony Convention, ESC, that says that the speed of light in both the outbound and inbound directions is the same. But there's an asynchronous Synchrony Convention, ASC, which suggests that maybe on the outbound, the speed of light is half the speed of half of C rather, half of the two-way speed, and coming into us is actually infinite, so that when something happens in the outer reaches of space, we see it instantly. Now, interestingly, the physics is exactly the same, and you cannot distinguish between the two. So it really becomes a definition issue or convention. Yep. So a philosophical difference. So maybe God created the universe with that attribute. So there are a number of different approaches that are being taken, but I think we need to always bear in mind we're addressing a week of miracles, and we indeed may never know. Yes. However, disciplines like relativity and so on may cast light on what God actually did, excuse the pun, in the fourth day of creation. But it's also worth bearing in mind, lest anyone feels that our position is not strong here, I actually think the biblical creationist position is much, much stronger than the secularist's position, because the secularist has a major light travel time problem too. And that comes about because when astronomers look at the distant parts of the universe, they see everything at essentially the same temperature. It's constant in temperature to about 1 part in 100,000, 1 in 10 to the fifth. It's like the flattest of billiard tables you could ever imagine. And that's a big problem for them, because at the instant of the Big Bang, there should have been hot regions and cold regions, which now somehow or other have shared their heat energy so that they are all now uniform. Problem is that there has not been enough time for the heat energy to get from the hot regions to the cold regions. So they call this the horizon problem. Now, the Big Bangers have invented a solution to that, which is a purely ad hoc solution. It involves an incredibly rapid expansion of space, an unbelievably short period of time after the initial quantum fluctuation. So it starts for no reason, it stops for no reason, and while it's in progress, you have special physics where matter repels matter rather than what we observe today, which is matter attracts matter through the law of gravity. So the secularist has to come up with an answer. He actually has to conjure up a miracle to solve his problem. And I guess we say the same, because the week in creation of Creation Week was a week of miracles. But the difference is we, of course, have a miracle worker. So miracles with a miracle worker is actually a perfectly coherent, logical basis on which to provide or seek an answer. But to imagine that a miracle occurred without a miracle worker is to believe in magic. Yeah. So the biblical creationist is actually in a very strong position in seeking to address this question of distant starlight.
Okay, thank you, Mark. That's great. Well, look, I just thought I'd make it open. If anyone had a question, I've got another couple of questions I want to fire at you. You received one of those, but there's another one that's come our way. Anybody got a question they'd like to ask Mark? Anybody? No. Well, let me. You would have got a copy of this question again in relation to light, Mark. So it's something that again is very important. And it's interesting the way he's framed the question. As God made light in its perfect form on the first day, emanating from him, could it have been possible for there to have been no speed limit to light when the stars were made on the fourth day, for example, before the fall? So as when Adam was formed on the sixth day, he could see God's creation of the stars. However, after the fall, everything changed when our dimension and God's dimension were ripped apart by the fall, that is, by sin. I think that's a good question.
It is. It's a very good question. In fact, it touches a little bit on what I shared before, this idea of that asymmetry in the speed of light. I actually believe that when Adam and Eve looked up at the stars on the evening of the sixth day, and as I often suggest, presumably holding hands, they would have looked at the beauty of the stars, and they would have seen essentially what we see today. So they wouldn't have seen stars popping into existence years later as the light reached them, for the simple reason that God created the stars for a purpose, and for that purpose to be fulfilled, they all had to be visible. So I think that Adam and Eve did see the stars on the night of the sixth day of creation. I guess that would fit in with this the ASC kind of interpretation that I explained earlier on. I would see it a little differently though, because at the end of the creation week, God had created a world, a physical world, which operated in accordance with all the laws of physics which he had established in the course of that week. And those laws of physics still essentially apply today. So, yes, there was a separation. The words used here were God's dimension from our dimension, but I see that more as in a spiritual sense. Yes. We became spiritually separated from God. But what also happened at the fall in the physical sense was, I believe, God withdrew some of his sustaining power, so that after the fall, the second law of thermodynamics started winning, if you like. So things began the relentless process of running down, which I don't believe was happening before the fall. Had it been, then the universe would have had, and the earth would have had, a finite life. Yeah. So that doesn't mean the second law was not operating before the fall. It was, but something else was happening to counterbalance it. Yep. And we get a little glimpse of that when we read of the children of Israel in the wilderness for 40 years, and their clothes and their shoes don't wear out. So God was doing something to reverse the effects of normal wear and tear. Nowadays, we see the wear and tear, the second law of thermodynamics, winning. Yes. So I think it's a good question, and hopefully that was helpful to...
I think the thing there, Mark, I think the thing that Nick was asking, the guy who asked the question, I think was the impact of the fall in terms of what it did to life. And I think that's what he was getting at. Was there some reason that we could look at that in terms of, from an apologetics perspective, how do we explain it to the non-Christian in terms of what happens and what impact the fall had on something like the speed of light, etc., etc. Now I know the answer to it really, but I think that's what he's trying to get at.
Yeah. So I guess what I'm saying is I don't think the speed of light would have changed as a result of the fall, because that's all about the fundamental underlying laws of physics which determine the operation of the universe.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Tim, fire away.
All right.
G'day, Tim. How are you? Good to see you.
Yep. I've been thinking lately, we're talking about cosmology still. We're told that the universe will run down in millions or maybe it's billions of years. Is that assumption based on the general idea that we think that it's been around for billions of years? Could in fact we be looking at the Earth in its current form running down sooner?
Okay, so the first part is that the secularists come to the conclusion that the universe is heading for a heat death based on observations, and that's fundamentally the second law of thermodynamics. So what they're doing there is trying to wind the processes of stellar life through the way that the stars are burning their nuclear fuel through fusion and so on, and projecting when they're going to end, that everything ultimately gets converted to heat, so the universe will die a heat death. And we're looking at, billions of years before that happens. So that's actually a pretty fair position based on just observations, but it's all about the second law of thermodynamics. I don't think that relies upon a belief that the universe came about by accident in and of itself, so much as really being a conclusion from observations. But I think I mentioned in the last talk I gave the dilemma that the secularist has when you ask the question, did the universe have a beginning? Because if they say, yes, it had a beginning, they have to violate the first law. If they say, no, it didn't, they violate the second law. So they're hung. The only way out of that dilemma is a creator God external to the physical creation, who speaks it into being and provides it with with the energy right at the outset.
Excellent, thank you, Mark. Anybody else like to ask a question? Yourself?
Yes. Yeah, Roland. Job said that the Lord spread the heavens out as like a curtain. If that was done with a propulsive force to that speed for spreading out was exceeded the speed of light, how would that affect the perceived age of the universe from the astronomer's point of view?
Yeah, in fact, it's there's about a dozen different places where God speaks of having stretched out the heavens. You know, we find it in Isaiah and Jeremiah, a number of Psalms, and in Job. So it could be that what secularists observe, or not just secularists, but astronomers observe, in terms of the redshift of stars, is a vestige of that stretching out. So there may be a connection there, although there are some cosmologists who believe that the universe could well, in fact, be static and not expanding at all. All we're seeing is the aftermath of God stretching it out. You have to remember, with cosmology, we don't have the luxury of being able to perform experiments. We've only got one thing that we can look at, and we can't say, well, what would have happened if, because we don't have an if. We can just look at it, and we have to interpret what we see as best we can, and of course we interpret it on the basis of our a priori worldview, what we already believe.
Yep.
So that's, I guess, is the big challenge in looking at things like that in cosmology.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else got a question? Yes, no? Yeah, okay. Well, here's one that's a little different. You heard of Hugo de Garis? I'm sure you have.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so, and this is a quote, "I will be arguing that those godlike creatures, hyper-artilects, become so intelligent, so powerful that they are capable of designing and building whole universes." That's a quote from September 2019. So the question goes something like this. Hugo de Garis imagines that artificial intelligence will get to the point where it can design and build universes, plural. He argues for a deoscience where our universe may have been a product of such a process/designer. So it's not so much a God-designed thing, but an artificial intelligence that takes over, as if you will. So, Mr. Harwood, I'm sure you can have some wise words to say on that one.
Well, look, a lot of these forecasts and prognoses like this reflect what people believe, you know. And if mankind has emerged out of a primordial warm pond somewhere and has managed to evolve over millions and millions of years to our current level, then we have this scenario of ever onward and upward, and everything's improving and getting better.
Yes.
But of course, that is totally contrary to what is actually observed. We've been talking about the second law, which is universal, and people recognise that everything is running down. I'm sure Don would have spoken about genetic entropy, the process of relentless accumulation of mutations in our genome.
Yep.
So mankind is actually getting worse and worse. I suspect that our level of intelligence is indeed far, far less than that of Adam and Eve. So we tend to think of the patriarchs as having recently swung out of the trees, but we think of it in terms of the biblical account, and in fact it's quite the reverse.
Yes.
So you're seeing a lot of wishful thinking. The whole idea about plural universes is just philosophical nonsense, really.
Yes.
The word universe means everything, everything that there is. So you can't, by definition, have more than one. And yet the secularist has a major problem trying to account for the staggeringly low probabilities of life emerging spontaneously without any supernatural designer. And to try and ease the problem, they suggest, well, maybe there are not just one universe, maybe there's lots and lots and lots of them. So if there are enough of them, we can reduce the probability to something reasonable, and we just happen to live in the lucky one where life arose. And
Yes.
here we are.
Indeed.
But it really is desperation and straw clutching.
Yes, I'm fearing that what you're saying is that the pharmaceutical companies are going to do very well. So it just seems like that. Anyone else got a question? Any more questions? No? No? Any more questions? No? Well, Mark, I think that's it, my friend. We're going to give you a short... Simon, sorry, I beg your pardon. I didn't see you. Hold on a sec.
I think people there are very courageous being there after 9 p.m. on Sunday. I'm impressed by you all.
Questions. Okay, far away.
Well, I guess it's not really a question, it's just a thought. Do you have any thoughts on the Nephilim and what happened there?
Yes, if you, in fact, if you look on creation.com, just type in the Nephilim, and you'll find there are some articles there. Also in Gary Bates's book,
Yes.
Alien Intrusion, you'll find there's, and in the latest version, there's a whole appendix devoted. No, actually, it's in the original edition. There's an appendix devoted to that. So theologians have a variety of views about the Nephilim. We don't have a particularly hard view. In fact, there are people within CMI that have slightly differing views on the subject. But it seems the one that makes the most sense are that the Nephilim were in fact fallen angels who were intent on polluting the human race. Remember, Satan knew from what God had said in Genesis 3:15 that the seed of the woman was going to crush his head. So if he can somehow or other so pollute the human race so that there would not possibly be a descendant of a woman who would be qualified to do such a thing, then maybe he could win. So he was all out to try and corrupt the human race. And hence the reference in Genesis 6 to the extraordinary degrees of evil and violence, to the point where it says the thoughts of man's hearts were only ever evil all the time, you know.
Yep.
But have a look on our website, and there are varying views on it. But one reasonable suggestion, it seems, is that they were in fact fallen angels.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Mark. Okay, one last offer. Any more? Oh, yep, got one down the back here. I shall speed my way down here. Just give name and question.
I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the nature of light itself. I don't understand why, I do study physics myself, why we assume that light has one speed, and that it's, my understanding is that the light spectrum is a range of lights, being photons of different sizes, they must then have different speeds. And I wondered if you could comment on that. And, you know, the speed of light in a vacuum is a speed basically of starlight, isn't it? It's sunlight. I think it was in Hawking's book mentioned that we don't entertain the idea that a photon of light can degrade in size as it goes and therefore change in speed. Why? Why do we stick to this idea that, because Einstein said it, it seems to me, I could be reading this wrong, that speed has one light. A light has one speed, and then we make all photons the same, even though we know they're not the same.
Okay, fire away, Mark.
Okay, that's a bit of a mixed bag. So can I just explain that electromagnetic energy covers a very wide range of frequencies. So you can start at very long wavelength, which means very low frequencies from radio signals, and come all the way up through to just the visible spectrum, which we can see, which is only in effect about 1 octave wide, if I can use a musical term, where the frequency essentially doubles from the long wavelength end, the red, through to the short wavelength end of blue, which we can actually see. But you then continue on beyond that, and you go up into to extremely short wavelength radiations. But it's all the same stuff, effectively. It's electromagnetic radiation. And what Einstein, well, let me come back a bit. Maxwell developed the 4 equations that describe electromagnetics, the most amazing piece of scientific research and mathematical deduction in the 1800s. And Einstein in the early 1900s developed his theories of both special and general relativity. Now, what Einstein began with was the assumption that the speed of light was a constant, meaning the speed of electromagnetic radiation, not just visible light. And what's interesting is when you develop the field equations from that and then perform observational experiments, it turns out that Einstein's theories have been verified over and over again. There are, for instance, a number of predictions, one of which is that time cannot be a constant throughout the universe if the speed of light to an observer is. And that's been verified. I often use the example of the satellite navigation system, or the GPS in your car. If you don't correct for the time dilation effects, the clocks on the satellites, the GPS satellites, actually tick quite a deal faster than identical clocks on the surface of the Earth. And they don't do that because there's something wrong with the clocks. It's because time actually flows faster in a lower gravitational field. That's a prediction of Einstein's equations. So observational experimental physics has supported his theory. And for that reason, it's very widely accepted. But we always bear in mind that there can be a subsequent breakthrough, which, just like Einsteinian physics, built upon but extended Newtonian physics. Newtonian physics doesn't explain everything. It appeared to for quite a while, but it started to fail. And it wasn't until Einstein came along that we realized there was new physics was involved. But Einsteinian equations, in fact, reduced down to the Newtonian ones at the appropriate scales, the sort of scales that we experience. So what we have there is experimental verification of Einstein. In terms of the speed of light being a constant, as I mentioned before, we are actually talking about the two-way speed of light, because it's not possible to measure the one-way speed. So it is possible, and all the mathematics still works the same, to have asymmetry in the speed of light. So the speed away from you could be different from the speed towards you. We can't actually decode that. All we can tell is the average two-way speed of light turns out through observation to always be c, irrespective of the frequency or the wavelength of the radiation.
Excellent. Okay, thank you, Mark. Thank you so much. Any other questions? Ah, yes, here we go. Isaiah.
Hi Mark, it's Isaiah here. This is not a gospel argument, it's a question that was thrown to me, and I'm interested to see what your view on it is. A friend asked if Adam would have a belly button. My response was he was created and not born of a biological mother, so he didn't have one. That's what I said. What would you say?
Well, I once heard a quite famous preacher say, look, I was asked once if Adam had a belly button. He said, I don't know, I wasn't there, which was just a kind of cheeky way to avoid the issue, simply because this particular preacher doesn't really grasp the significance of the Genesis account. A better way to ask that question is, did Adam have a mother, which I think is what you're identifying. And of course he did not, because God made him from out of the ground and breathed into him and became a living being. So did he actually have a belly button or not? Well, we don't really know, but it would seem most unlikely, because if he did, it would imply that he had a physical mother, and it also would probably come into the category of being somewhat deceptive, because he would have this scar in his abdomen which would have served no purpose. I've got a feeling that as the wickedness in the world was starting to grow, that people would say, I'm sure someone would try the line, really, there's no God, you can't see him. And all Adam would have to do is lift up his T-shirt and you'd say, look, no belly button, that's done deal, argument over.
Yeah.
So when Adam and Eve die, he's not there to flick up his T-shirt, right? So then people say, wow, and so away they go. And great wickedness then spread out over the face of the earth up to the time of Noah.
Okay, thank you, Mark. I'm not suggesting anybody lift up their T-shirt or anything like that, but that's... Okay, name and then question.
Hi, this is Kira. I just had a question regarding sharing the gospel with people. I've heard that. So recently I've been doing the Way of the Master course with some friends, and they're very much focused on speaking to the conscience and not getting caught up in discussions and debates about things like evolution. But in the last session, Don was saying that we need the creation foundation in order to be able to explain the gospel. And I was just asking on your view of whether it's better to start a conversation speaking directly to the conscience, or to sort of face the danger of getting caught up just debating about creation and evolution.
Yeah, Kira, that's a very good question. Look, I think you need to be sensitive to where God is leading you, because there are many, many ways in which the Holy Spirit will draw people to himself. Got to remember, God loves this person that you're sharing your faith with far more than you do. Jesus went to the cross for them. So for some people, there are no particular intellectual obstacles. It becomes an issue that they just need to understand that they are loved, and when they understand the extent to which God loves them and the sacrifice he made for them, they respond positively to that. For other people, however, there are intellectual barriers, and in fact, you would have seen, in fact, both Don and I shared the statistics from the Barna Group, which showed in Australia and New Zealand the number one issue that was a barrier to young people in the 18 to 35-year-old age range from being interested in things of faith was science. And by science is meant the whole idea of evolution. In other words, we got here by accident. There is no God. God's just an invention of our minds. So as you're sharing your faith, it's, I think, almost inevitable that you will encounter the question. But Peter says, always be prepared to give an answer. And that implies that you've been asked a question. So if you haven't been asked the question, there may be absolutely no need to get involved in a complex discussion about creation or evolution. In fact, it could be quite counterproductive at that stage. However, if it's a stumbling block, it will be raised, and that's when you need to be prepared. And that's what our ministry is about equipping people to be prepared. Firstly, to know there are answers, but secondly, to know where to go to get them. You don't have to have them all in your head, no one does, but you can say to the person, now that's a good question, I'll get back to you on that, and because I know there's an answer to that. Go find it and come and answer. And then you do the kind of foundation building that Don was talking about. That's what Paul had to do when he spoke to the Areopagus in Greece. You know, they had no foundation. When Peter spoke to the Jews, there was a foundation in place. He simply told them who the Messiah was, and 3,000 came to the Lord. Paul had a much bigger task to do, and in our culture, we are in a Greek environment. So very often you will find you will need to address the question of the God being the creator God. But it's all about being sensitive to the leading of the Holy Spirit, and you don't go down any particular path other than where God is leading you, because it's all about meeting the person's need at the time. If it's an issue, they will raise it, and then you're prepared to deal with it.
Okay, thank you so much, Mark. Anybody else for a question? Oh, yes, Roland. Here we go. Thank you, my friend. Go for it.
Thanks. Roland again. In WA, a new museum is about to be opened. How aware across Australia are the museum directors aware of, say, the creation of biblical view of fossil specimens in their possession?
So I wasn't quite sure I caught the question. Are you saying, are they aware? Was that your question? Are they aware of the biblical view?
I guess it's a leading question. Are they aware of the alternative view of their fossil specimens?
Look, I would think most would be, because people write to them. There are people going to museums and speak very loudly about this is a load of rubbish or whatever. Sometimes Christians can be a bit unwise. We do have to use wisdom when we're approaching an unbeliever. Got to remember their whole perspective is radically different, and so you need to establish first of all a communication bridge. And there are people who are somewhat insensitive, I think, and come in really hard and strong and say this is all rubbish. And of course they get classified as loonies. So it doesn't really help the Christian cause particularly to do that. So I expect that most museum curators would be well aware that there's a bunch of people out there who believe the earth is not billions of years old, who don't sign up to the evolutionary story. Many of them would dismiss such people as us as just fringe dwellers, not being educated. In fact, it's rather interesting, the fact that ministries like CMI exist with quite a large number of PhD scientists is a great problem for some of these people. I remember giving a talk at a secular university, and it actually was on a secular topic. It was on design of communication spacecraft. And afterwards, or during the Q&A session, someone put their hand up and said, well, this was in South Africa. And they said, why are you in South Africa, Dr. Harwood? And I said, oh, well, actually, I'm here because I now represent Creation Ministries, and I explained what I did. And there was a stunned look. And afterwards, this guy was walking around shaking his head. How could an intelligent person like you believe this stuff? So it's very confronting, because it confronts people's worldviews. And when you confront people's worldviews, their beliefs, they often respond by becoming defensive. And when you get someone who's on the defensive, you have to be very careful, because you can easily get to a point of winning an argument but losing the person. The objective is to win the person. And sometimes wisdom says, just drop the argument. Don't push it, So we need to be, as I said earlier, sensitive to the leading of the Holy Spirit. But anyway, back on the topic, I think most of these guys are well aware that there are people out there called creationists who reject what they're doing in their museums. But I don't think many of them recognise how strong the case is.
No, that's great. I think sometimes we get lost in the dueling intellects sometimes.
Yeah,
so it's important. Any other questions? Any other questions? Well, Mark, I think that's it. We've come to the end of the Q&A. Thank you so much for your time. We really do appreciate it. Thank you for all your talks, all the hard work and recording, and it was just great. We really enjoyed it, and I trust the Lord continue to bless you and encourage you and keep you in all that you're doing, and that you have a good nana nap after that.
Yes, I will. So, thank you, Carl, and thank you to everyone who is still there.
Yes.
I'm very impressed that you're there now at 9:45 on a Sunday night. That's pretty awesome.
Yes.
And it has been a great privilege to be able to contribute into the weekend.
Well, thank you so much, and all the best, and I'm sure we'll be in touch.
Okay.
Okay,
Thank
God
you.
bless. Thank you so much.
Indeed.
Bye
God
now.
bless.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.